In today's episode, we uncover the terrifying true story of the Nightmare House haunting and the chilling encounters experienced by those who lived there. From unexplained noises to terrifying apparitions, the entity was no longer content to linger in the shadows. It wanted something more. Before I share this with you, if you're a fan of scary stories, mysteries and the unexplained, don't forget to like and subscribe, as we will be posting a new story at least once a week. On a damp November evening in 1962, a cold mist rolled in over Northfleet, England, clinging to the cobblestone streets like a shroud. Number 16 Waterdale stood on a long road of semi-detached houses, illuminated by the weak, flickering light of a street lamp. The Maxted family moved into 16 Waterdales, and the family consisted of 28-year-old Sidney and his wife Mary, together with their children, 6-year-old Kevin, 4-year-old Linda and baby Claire. Not long after moving in, Mary started to hear noises coming from the upstairs bedroom, which was situated over the family living room. The first signs were subtle. It was Mary who noticed it first, but she kept her concerns to herself, not wanting to alarm her husband. The noises sound like footsteps walking across the floor, pacing to and fro, and she also had the feeling that someone was watching her. After a while, it wasn't only Mary who heard the footsteps, Sidney heard them too. Every time they went upstairs to investigate the source of the footsteps, they found the room was empty. Sidney came to the conclusion that the footsteps must be transmitted along the floorboards from their neighbour's house and can be heard in their bedroom. The strange happenings continued, a faint tapping sound in the dead of the night coming from the walls of their bedroom. Doors that refused to stay closed no matter how firmly they were latched. After a while, Sidney and his wife just couldn't explain away what was happening and also what their children had been experiencing. At night, their children, Kevin and Linda, both began to complain that they were waking up and hearing scratching noises, which came from underneath their beds. And other evenings, the bed covers were pulled right off. Even more terrifying, they reported being slapped, hit and pulled by invisible hands. The children became more and more frightened and didn't want to sleep in their own beds, so they started to sleep in their parents' room. For 3 years the strange incidents of phenomena continued, but in February 1965 everything changed. In the early hours of the morning, around 2 a.m, Mary heard Claire crying and got out of bed to check on her and settle her down. She had just returned to bed and pulled the covers around her as she felt a sudden chill in the room. She sprang upright as she noticed the figure of a young girl at the bedroom door entering the room. Mary was startled and instantly said, "Is that you, Linda?" But she soon realised that this figure wasn't her daughter at all. Mary sat frozen and unable to move. The figure swept slowly and silently across the room, coming towards her. As it became closer, it became larger and larger until it was a tall, eerie figure, towering and menacingly over the entire bed. Suddenly she started to scream and the haunting vision vanished. Her husband Sidney woke up, and after his wife had calmed down and told him what had happened, they decided that they couldn't spend another night in that house. The next day they packed up their belongings and left the house as quickly as they could. The Maxteds were the only family to report the strange goings-on, and there were no problems ever reported from former tenants. The house didn't remain empty for long, as Northfleet Council reallocated 16 Waterdales to a new family and tenant, 25-year-old Eric Essex and his wife Margaret and their baby. Before accepting the tenancy, Eric was aware of the rumours surrounding the house. However, he was a man of logic and dismissed the rumours about the property as nothing more than the superstitions of a small-town community. His wife Margaret had her reservations but chose to keep them to herself, focusing instead of settling the family into their new home. It wasn't long before Eric and Margaret soon began to hear the eerie sound of unexplained footsteps in their home. On one occasion, Margaret was sitting in the living room with her mother, who was visiting. Suddenly, they both heard the footsteps coming from the bedroom above, and they heard scraping sounds like furniture being dragged around. Margaret and her mother shouted Eric, who was outside in the garden. They explained the sounds they heard coming from upstairs, so they all rushed upstairs to the bedroom, but there was no one in there, and no one in the house. One afternoon, Eric was in his study when he heard the sound of footsteps outside the door. The footsteps paused, then resumed louder and more deliberate. Rising from his chair, Eric opened the door, expecting to see his wife, but instead, he was greeted by an empty hallway, the sound of the footsteps still echoing faintly around him. By August 1966, nearly 18 months after moving in, Eric was awakened around 2 a.m. by the familiar sound of footsteps moving around the stairs and hall. Although he was used to the strange noises, he still got out of bed and went out onto the landing to check if everything was okay and to check the rooms downstairs, but they were all empty. He had just returned to bed when he noticed a strange whistling sound in his ears. Suddenly he froze. He realised that the bed was shaking violently and vibrating. He held his breath as he stared towards the end of the bed as it was being lifted up into the air. He tried to sit up and look to his side, but to his horror, there stood a figure in the form of a tall woman whose white dress flowed down to the floor. The apparition was bright and glowing, but what terrified Eric the most was that the figure was headless. As quickly as it arrived, the figure vanished. Eric spoke with Margaret, telling her that the encounter was absolutely terrifying and that they quickly packed up their belongings and left the house, vowing never to return. Number 16 remained empty, but strange sounds could still be heard emanating from within. Mrs. Margaret Harrison, who lived next door at number 14 for about 3 months, regularly heard the sound of hefty footsteps ascending the stairs at all hours. One evening, while Mr. Harrison was away on business, Mrs. Harrison heard heavy thudding on the stairs next door, and then a heavy boom as if a massive heavy object was smashing down the stairs, and whatever was making the banging sound was under Mrs. Harrison's bedroom. The thudding under the bed turned to a scratching and scraping sound, which seemed to emanate from across the whole floor and grow in volume, as if something from under the floor was trying to claw its way up into the bedroom. Mrs. Harrison was so frightened that as soon as Mr. Harrison returned, she and her husband packed up and left number 14, never to return. Thank you for listening.